equality means sharing power. And so everybody in this room probably cares about inequality. None of us are compelled to act on it. So what advice do you give other influential and wealthy people about how and what they need to do to share their power?
Well, I think we have to think about how we democratize access to opportunities. And then what does that really mean? Like structurally, not only in a given point in time, but also kind of over time. And I think those are two distinct but complementary areas of focus. What do we need to do today? And then what do we need to do kind of for the tomorrow that, I certainly hope that my children will grow up in. And I think kind of one of the ways we do that is to create expectations of engagement. And then to facilitate people to actually engage. So if we think about an area I'm often asked about, politics, I'm often asked, like, are you going to run for political office one day? And I always respond with sharing that the first time someone asked me that question, I was 3. And you laugh, but that said something pretty powerful to me, right? Like, we expect you to at least to consider to do something important and powerful. So then I turn and I look at the person who's asked me that question and said, like, have you ever asked anyone whose last name Clinton was in that question? Did anyone ever ask you that question? Right? So I think it starts with kind of what expectations kind of we're giving to young people. Like, do we expect like other young people to be an editor at Bloomberg? We should. Or to be an executive at Bank of America? We should. And then what opportunities should then be incumbent on those of us who do have power, influence, and resources to help to provide. So if we think about kind of politics, there's a lot of emphasis now on how many women and young people are running for office, right? Unprecedented numbers of women are running for Congress. Unprecedented numbers of people under 35 are running for Congress. That's great, but percentages matter too, right? Still fewer than a quarter of the people running for Congress are under 35, and fewer than a quarter of people running for Congress are women. So while we have unprecedented numbers, we're still very far from equality. But thankfully, we do now have lots of organizations that are focused on recruiting, training, and supporting women and young people, not only to run for Congress, but to run for school board, city council, state legislatures, and kind of every other part of our elected ecosystem.
Okay, that's a great segue to my next question, because I want to ask you
about... I didn't even know that, but happy to help.
Talk about generational inequity for a minute. So you're on the cusp of being a Gen Xer, but technically millennial. I am definitely a Gen Xer. Between our two demographic groups, we make up 2/3 of the U.S. population, but we hold relatively little power in certain corners. So only 6% of corporate board seats, and millennials are wholly underrepresented in Congress. So how does your generation, my generation, but really yours and younger, really change the inequality debate if we don't have a seat at the table?
Well, I think that part of it is having more young people in conversations like this, right? And having kind of more opportunities to share our thoughts and our ideas about what we think is kind of right, wrong, and how to get to kind of more of what we think is right. I think that, we do have a responsibility to each do in our own lives whatever it is we say we think is important socially and societally. I think kind of every small thing we can do to kind of give an opportunity to someone else, I think helps shift that equation. But I think we all need to listen more, right, to younger people. And I think we need to kind of follow when they are leading us, as we see certainly powerfully right now from the Parkland students around the gun violence prevention movement in our country, and also what we see powerfully from the coalition of students in Chicago. So I think it is paying attention, but it's also providing and creating spaces where we are not only showing that we're valuing, but we're validating young voices. And I don't think we can do that too much ever.
Okay, so just going back to a point you made earlier when you were asked if you would run for political office at 3, you're a little older now. What is the one thing that would compel you to channel what you're doing now into a more politically active role, particularly when you look at that gender discussion? or generational discussion?
Well, I would say I'm fairly politically active. I think there are ways for us to be politically active without running for public office. I think that we're citizens every day, regardless of whether we're running for office or kind of whether it's an election year or an election day. And I think that is a important point, and particularly an important point now. I mean, we're citizens in the way that we treat each other, in the way that we listen to each other, in the way we respect each other. I mean, I never thought, and I think this also candidly is a privilege that I have to recognize and own and take responsibility for. I never thought that kindness and respect would be the acts of resistance that they are right now in our country, and yet also the acts of affirmation for certainly not only the values that I am trying to teach my children at home, but kind of the values that I want to see more of in the world. And so for me, I think, to run for public office, a few things have to be true. I think you have to have a clear view of what you would do with that job. And I think that's a really crucial point, because I think a lot of times there's frustration directed at Washington, understandably, and yet sometimes that frustration would better be directed at the local or state level. And so I talk often to young people and listening to where their areas of concern are the deepest, the most intense, the most urgent, and often, understandably and thankfully, they're around criminal justice reform, right? But about 90% of the people incarcerated in our country are incarcerated in local jails and state prisons. So if kind of young people really want to change that, like put it on the agenda of their state legislatures, right, or their city council, like think about running for attorney general themselves or governor one day. And so the reason I share that is because I think it's really important, if we are going to encourage more young people to run for office, that young people realize like what's really possible to be done at the school board level, or what's really possible to be done at the state legislature level. And then I think the second thing that has to be true is you have to believe that your kind of skill and competence, that your energies, your persistence will enable you to hopefully kind of do the job that you want to do, like as a city council member or a state representative. And then finally, I think you have to think you do a better job than the person who's in the job today. And if those are true, then like I hope anyone sitting here today, or you'll urge other people in your life to think about running for office, particularly if they're part of the 2/3 of the population that is currently underrepresented at every level of government.
So is it fair to say that as it is now, you're as politically active as you're going to be?
I mean, yes. I mean, right now, I certainly have no plans to run for office. I really like my city councilwoman. She's new. I think she's doing a really good job. Right. So if we just start at the local level and work up, I clearly disagree with our president on I think, honestly, everything. And yet, that's like certainly not where I think my energies are best directed, except for continuing to stand up for what I believe is right and to stand against what I believe is wrong.